It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon for Angela, a young black woman heading home from work. But everything changed when she was stopped by two police officers for no clear reason. What started as a routine interaction quickly escalated into something far worse. The officers, armed with more than just authority, decided to humiliate Angela in ways that were completely unjust and demeaning. Little did they know, their actions would have serious consequences. Angela's father, a man with a quiet but commanding presence, was not someone to be underestimated. When he learned of what happened to his daughter, he wasn't just angry, he was ready to fight back with everything he had. But this wasn't a fight of fists or violence. It was a battle of strategy, determination, and unshakable moral courage. Stay tuned as this powerful story unfolds and justice takes an unexpected turn. Angela was shaken, but determined to stay calm as the officers continued to press her with demeaning questions. Their tone was sharp, laced with condescension, and their actions seemed more about intimidation than enforcing the law. She asked repeatedly what she had done wrong, but her questions were brushed aside. Passers-by started to notice the scene, but no one stepped in. Some looked concerned, others turned away. Angela's father, Mr. Johnson, was a retired lawyer who had spent years fighting for justice. When Angela called him, her voice trembling with anger and fear, he knew this was no ordinary encounter. As she explained what had happened, he listened carefully, already planning his next move. What the officers didn't know was that Mr. Johnson had a deep understanding of the system they were abusing. He wasn't just coming to defend his daughter, he was coming to hold them accountable. Mr. Johnson arrived at the scene just as the officers were wrapping up their so-called questioning. His calm but firm demeanor immediately shifted the energy. He approached Angela, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, letting her know she wasn't alone anymore. Turning to the officers, he asked for their names and badge numbers, his voice steady but commanding. The officers hesitated, sensing that this was someone who knew his rights, and theirs too. Angela, still visibly upset, began recounting everything that had happened, while Mr. Johnson listened carefully, taking mental notes. Around them, a small crowd had formed, quietly observing. Among them was a young man recording the interaction on his phone. The tension grew thicker as one of the officers tried to downplay the situation, insisting it was a routine check. But Mr. Johnson wasn't buying it. "Routine?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Would you say the same if my daughter looked like you?" The officer's face stiffened at Mr. Johnson's question, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned to his partner, as if searching for backup. The crowd was now growing restless, their murmurs filling the air. Angela stood a little taller, her father's presence giving her strength. She watched as he calmly but firmly pressed the officers for an explanation, refusing to let them brush this aside. "Sir, step back," one officer warned, his voice sharp. But Mr. Johnson didn't flinch. "I have no intention of stepping back," he replied, his tone unwavering. "What I will do is ensure you're held accountable for the way you treated my daughter. So I'll ask again, why was she stopped? What probable cause did you have?" The officer faltered, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the questions and the growing number of phones recording them. Still, they doubled down, refusing to admit fault. Mr. Johnson wasn't done. Pulling out his phone, he began dialing a number. "If you won't answer me, perhaps you'll answer your department's legal team. Or would you prefer the media?" His words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, the officers looked truly unsettled. The tension was unbearable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Just as Mr. Johnson finished his sentence, another police cruiser pulled up to the scene. A senior officer stepped out, his expression stern and unreadable. The two officers seemed visibly relieved at first, but that relief quickly faded when the senior officer approached Mr. Johnson instead of them. "Mr. Johnson," the senior officer said, recognizing him immediately. It turned out they had crossed paths years ago, when Mr. Johnson had successfully taken on a high-profile case of police misconduct. The two officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they were in deeper trouble than they'd thought. Angela watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding. The senior officer turned to the two men, his voice sharp. "What's going on here? And why do I have multiple calls about this incident already?" The officers stammered, striving to explain, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Neither was Mr. Johnson. Sensing an opportunity, he calmly stepped forward. "I'll be happy to explain," he said, his tone measured but deliberate. "But first, I'd like to make sure my daughter's rights aren't further violated." Just as the senior officer nodded, a bystander stepped forward, waving their phone. "I have everything recorded," they said. The officers froze, realizing their actions were now documented from multiple angles. The tension was suffocating, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, the senior officer turned to the recording, his face darkening as he began to watch. As the senior officer watched the footage, his expression shifted from frustration to alarm. The video revealed every detail: the dismissive tone, the baseless accusations, and the officer's clear attempt to intimidate Angela. The crowd watched in silence, their anticipation growing with every passing second. "This is unacceptable," the senior officer finally said, his voice cold. He turned to the two officers, his glare sharp enough to cut through steel. "You've crossed a line, several, in fact. Turn in your badges and report to the precinct immediately." The officers started to protest, but he cut them off. "Don't make this worse for yourselves. You've humiliated this woman and embarrassed this department." As they reluctantly walked away, heads hung low, the crowd erupted into applause. Angela felt a wave of relief, but her father remained composed. Just as they thought the ordeal was over, the senior officer turned to Mr. Johnson. "I owe you an apology," he said, "and a warning. This isn't the first time I've dealt with officers like them." He paused, his tone brave. "It won't be the last." As Mr. Johnson nodded, Angela realized her father wasn't just standing up for her, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged. The victory was theirs for now, but the battle for justice was far from over. As the crowd began to disperse, Angela looked at her father with a mixture of gratitude and pride. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly, her voice steady now. "You didn't just stand up for me, you reminded me what real strength looks like." Mr. Johnson smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't ever let anyone take your dignity away," he said. "Not ever." The senior officer assured them that a formal investigation would follow, but Mr. Johnson knew better than to trust empty promises. He made a point to gather the bystanders' contact information and ensure the recordings were preserved. As they walked away, Angela felt lighter, knowing she wasn't alone in this fight. But deep down, she also knew this was part of a much bigger problem. Her father had shown her that justice was possible, but it required persistence, courage, and an unwavering belief in doing what's right.